Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader. Today, our guest is Jonathan Alter, author of His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life, published in September by Simon & Schuster. So Jonathan is an award-winning author, political analyst, columnist, and radio host. His previous work includes The Center Holds, Obama and His Enemies, The Promise, Obama's Year One, and The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. You can find Jonathan on NBC News, MSNBC. Oh, and he was the winner of this year's Emmy for Breslin and Hamill, which is really interesting, Deadline artists. So let's see. Jimmy Carter's presidency is one that is kind of barely remembered, littered with seemingly failure at times, as well as embarrassment and frustration. And this really bothers me because notwithstanding that and the misunderstandings, at 96 years old, Carter remains one of the most honest, charitable, hardworking, intelligent, and admirable person that I can think of. So let's sort all this out with Jonathan. And normally I would love to do it on my own, but today we're lucky to have with us my colleague who works with us here at my independent bookstore, which is Wellington Square Books, and where your book, Jonathan, is sitting on our front table.
Great.
Which is great since we're open and we can also drop ship it. So anyway, today we have with us Jim Scott, who was a former White House fellow and a member of President Carter's White House staff. So normally, even though I like to talk someone's ear off, I can't do it here. So who better than to ask the questions today? So welcome, Jonathan and Jim, and thanks to both of you for joining us today. And Jim, like I said, why don't you start us off?
Well, thanks, Sam. First, I'd like to thank Jonathan for giving us this time. You are an extremely busy guy. I sense from your bio and stuff that I've read about you. And I just like to make a quick confession about us. We have not stacked and collected most of those wonderful books, which you have featured in the Lucas Project. And I want to tell you that we will be stocking more of those as time goes
Great.
by.
Great.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I am the chair of board of something called the J. Anthony Lucas Prize Project, and we give awards for narrative nonfiction to try to nurture the importance of these wonderful nonfiction works in the culture. So I'm glad that you're going to stock some of our award winners. And I just have to say, I'm thrilled to be associated with Wellington Books. Any association I can have with an independent bookseller is it's an honor for me.
As it is for us too.
Well, I want to bless you also for your good health and taking on the task of trying to rescue Jimmy Carter's life of consequence. I think those are words directly from your book. I would say it's more like trying to climb Mount Everest without oxygen. It must have been an extremely exhausting exercise, exhilarating, but exhausting. And I wonder if that's how you felt as you were writing this book.
Well, I think at the very beginning, Jim, it was because presidential biographies, and this was the first of Carter, which is both good news because they had this huge hole in the line of scrimmage. There have been 9 of Ted Kennedy, 9 biographies. Ted Kennedy, who was his big rival, never was president, and he led a very important life, but it just gives you an example of how much running room I had on this project. So that was exhilarating. But the prospect of of going through so many of these papers, and there was no chance I was going to be able to look at all of them because there are literally millions of pages of papers at the Carter Library in Atlanta. So that was daunting and at a certain point intimidating. But I have to say that something happened to me early in the process that gave me a lot of energy. And that is that I was sitting in the Carter Library in June of 2015 and going over his papers. And I was asked to go on MSNBC and comment about Donald Trump coming down the escalator and announcing his candidacy for president. And over the next 5 years, I found that Jimmy Carter was an escape, almost a vacation from this, orange president squatting in my brain. So in that sense, it was energizing, not exhausting, because I could find relief by returning to this president who, was a man of, for all his flaws, a man of honesty, decency, accountability, and his papers almost brushed away the toxins of the Trump era. So really, I don't think the whole experience ever exhausted me. I did become obsessed with Jimmy Carter, as I think all biographers do at one point or another. And in his case, it was because of his complexity. And I spent the last, at least part of the last 5 years of my life trying to figure out who this guy who has led this novelistic life. I mean, his life is a true American epic, but to figure out who he is and who he was and what motivated him and to peel away the layers. Some of it was the sugarcoating that he put on his own life that I had to strip away to get at, my sense of what the truth was. But all of that was ultimately exhilarating, I would say.
Great. I appreciate that rundown. I just so that you can spot me in the White House, I worked for Ann Wexler.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so you can imagine the
Yes.
amount of running around and the context that I had and the excitement that I enjoyed.
So what year was it that you were a fellow?
78, 79.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was an intern in the summer of 1978 in the speechwriting office, but Ann Wexler, dwelled at a level way above me, and I certainly didn't meet her that summer. But just to let listeners and viewers know, Ann Wexler, who's now deceased, was a very savvy, powerful Washington insider and a real pathbreaker as a political operative in Washington. It was a role that very few women had, and by the end of the Carter administration, she was one of the most important of Jimmy Carter's aides.
I would agree with that, and I'll tell you, trying to keep up with her was tough because she was all action, very little talk, and all action. So it was fun. I'm thinking, I made the characterization about climbing Mount Everest, but I was going to also ask you if you were going to, you like writing about presidents, FDR, Obama, that if you wrote about Trump, would it be more like a journey into the Marianas Trench rather than climbing Mount Everest?
Well, I won't write about Trump. I mean, I might write about various stories that come out of the Trump administration, but I won't write about Donald Trump, the man, for two reasons. First is, I think was summarized by Stephen Colbert. I went on his show to promote this book, but it was earlier, and I think he's actually said it a number of times. He finds Donald Trump boring, even though he lampoons him every night. there's nothing to figure out about Donald Trump. He's enormously predictable, and he's not a complex individual. We know exactly who he is. And so if you're a biographer, that's no fun. Jimmy Carter
Right.
is hugely complicated. And I think for a reader, it's much more interesting. I mean, what is there to learn about Donald Trump at this point? We know who he is. And the second thing is you have to live with the subject of a biography for a long time, because if you're going to do it right, it takes years. And why in God's name would I want to live with Donald Trump for one more second, much less
Yeah.
years of my life? So that's a resounding no on writing about Trump. Now, that doesn't mean I have to, adore anybody that I write about, but they have to be interesting enough and I think ultimately inspiring enough that you can live with them.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sam.
I was just going to say, as a neophyte in this, and you guys kind of know him intimately in two different ways, in the reviews, a lot of them just focus on every embarrassing incident, from the rabbit to the hostages. And I wonder why, I think it was the Times review that kind of just said, basically it was all negative. There wasn't one positive thing really in that review. And that's, I think, the viewpoint that a lot of people have. It's like embarrassing or laughable, especially the rabbit. But how do you feel about the reviews that essentially ignore the fact that you, as you just said, a complicated man who achieved a great deal in some ways?
Well, I don't think most of the reviews have said that. I mean, I don't want to.
Well, okay.
I don't want to criticize the reviews because they've all been extremely positive. But if you look at, say, the one that it was on NPR.org, that critic who used to be chair of the National Book Critics Circle, like the organization of critics, and he
Right.
loved the book and recounted a number of the positive things that Carter had accomplished. The excuse me. I deal with the killer rabbit incident when he was in a canoe when he was president, and this fierce-looking rabbit comes up and he, pushes it away with a paddle. And I deal with the Playboy interview at some length, actually, because it almost cost him the presidency in 1976, and his collapsing in a road race when he was president, running cross country. I deal with all of those things, but I tried to put them in their proper place. I mean, it's kind of crazy that this is what we remember this guy for when, he was the greatest environmental president in American history, with the possible exception of Theodore Roosevelt, who actually wasn't really involved in industrial pollution. So you could make an argument that Carter was actually the single greatest environmental president. He took the federal government from tokenism to genuine diversity. He set a new global standard for how governments should treat their people with his human rights policy, which, however hypocritical it was at times, was credited with helping end the Cold War by conservatives. So, and I'm just getting started on the accomplishments. So it does, I just think it is skewed to put too much emphasis on those embarrassing incidents. Having said that, there was something about Carter that, he almost had like a kick me sign on his back. So Carter was Velcro, everything stuck to him, and Reagan, who beat him badly in 1980, was Teflon. Everything slid off of him. And I explore why Carter, that happened to Carter. And there's some of the blame rests with his critics and the press, and some of the blame rests on Carter. But it's a subject that I explore in the book at various times. And of course, I want to keep the things that he did that were embarrassing, because they are part of the story and they're also fun
Right.
to read about. So when he gives a toast in Mexico when he's president and talks about Montezuma's revenge, talks about diarrhea when he's toasting the Mexican president. Do I include that? Hell yeah. You know, or if I hear, I was always looking for the fun story. So at one point I interviewed Amy Carter, and it was only second interview that was ever done with her. And I had interviewed her parents at length and on many occasions. And they, gave me entree to the rest of the family. They asked Amy to sit down with me. So we had lunch, we had a good interview, and we were talking about her aunt, Jimmy's sister, Gloria, who it was well known at the time that she was the den mother for the Hells Angels. And on her tombstone reads, she rides in Harley heaven now.
Yeah.
And she had the Hells Angels guarding her hospital room when she was dying in the 1980s. And so I just asked her, if there were other things about Gloria that I should know. And Amy said, well, she had tattoos. I said, oh, that's interesting. That was a little ahead of her time, And I said, what did she have a tattoo of? And Amy said, Tweety Bird pushing a lawnmower. So when I would hear things like that, I of course wanted to and did include the fun stuff to go along with, the analysis of his achievements as president and as a former president.
Yeah, it's fun reading that because we knew that Jimmy Carter was not a king in a purple robe walking around with a crown, and he also had a very interesting accent. That Georgian accent is something that drives a lot of people crazy. I lived for a long time in Texas, and people in Texas who talk funny would make fun of any Georgian because they talk even funnier. And just the way he spoke, it turned a lot of people off, which was.
And I think there was a fair amount of anti-Southern bias.
Yeah.
And because, look, he was made and unmade by Watergate. He was made by Watergate because he had this message of "I'll never lie to you," healing, a little bit like Biden's message, against Trump. He was running against Gerald Ford, who had taken over from Nixon, but it was the stench of Watergate was still there. He started running for president only less than 6 months after Nixon resigned, and so Watergate helped make him, but then the Watergate press corps just ate him alive almost from the moment he got there. And, his press secretary, Jody Powell, said, we not only didn't get a honeymoon, we didn't get a one-night stand.
Right.
So and I think there was a fair amount of anti-Southern bias in the attitude of the Washington establishment. And Carter did not reach out to them. There's blame on him too. But, I found a lot of kind of snotty remarks about Carter's Southern heritage. And I think the only folks who did not engage in that, and I think you would agree with this, Jim, were African Americans who stuck with Carter through thick and thin. And, he never lost his support in the African American community, even when he was getting crushed by Reagan.
That is so true, and you could have gotten even a better picture of his fairness with respect to the African American community had you been able to interview Louis Martin.
Yes.
Who was
yes.
with the wonderful ex-editor.
Yeah. So I went in the Louis Martin papers at the Carter Library, and I had known about Louis Martin, who was an unsung hero of the civil rights movement, and really, I'd say more powerful across several administrations than any other African American official, including like the first African American members of the cabinet. He had a lot of influence, and I didn't end up dealing with Louis Martin, but I did point out that after ducking the civil rights movement and in one of the meanest counties in the Jim Crow South, and quite a bit of the early part of my book is about this. And Carter is not covering himself in glory in this period. He's not explicitly racist, but he doesn't bother to meet Dr. King. He later becomes quite close to Daddy King, but he's ducking. But after he becomes governor, and he basically integrates Georgia state government, appoints the first black judges, the first black senior aides to a governor, then he does pretty much the same thing when he becomes president for black judges and for women judges. So when he appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the bench, not to the Supreme Court, but just plucked her out of obscurity. And she was later asked, when did you decide you wanted to be a judge? And she said, well, when Jimmy Carter decided that half the human race had something to offer, and he appointed 5 times as many women judges as all of his predecessors combined.
Right.
And the numbers are very similar for black judges. And I think the figure is to the appellate bench, just below the Supreme Court, he appointed, I believe it was 8 black judges. Ronald Reagan, who was president for twice as long, appointed 1. And so, and he had a consciousness about racial injustice that you can see starting from when he is governor. And then, this extends into his post-presidency, where, of course, he's now, families name their children after him in Africa. That's giving you some sense of his contributions to Africa.
Yeah, he was he was amazing in that regard. I remember the first day I showed up at the White House. This was back before all the security required you to list everybody back to your great grandmother as to who you were. But I drove up to the gate, and I was mistaken for being Louis Martin.
Oh, wow. Wow.
All black men look alike back then.
Wow. He was so much older than you, though.
I know.
I mean,
but anyway, they didn't even ask me for ID. They saw me. I stuck my head out of the car, and I was ready to give them my ID. And they opened up the gate, and I drove into the White House parking lot, which is virtually impossible to do.
Yeah. That's right between the West Wing and the old executive office building.
Right.
And that's only for senior staffers. They're the only ones parking there. And right now, I would imagine after 9/11, nobody parks there.
Nobody parks there.
Yeah.
So anyway, I parked there.
That's crazy.
Louis Martin Jr.
Yeah.
But the characterization that many of us saw it was really sad to see how the president was mocked. The piece in the LA Times, which when he talked about the moral equivalent of war, and that was the energy embargo, and the moral equivalent of war. Well, the acronym on that was MEOW, and the Times called it his MEOW speech.
Yeah, well,
which really was a put down.
So that was from the late New York Times columnist William Safire, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his columns about Burt Lance, who was Carter's close friend and budget director, who had some banking irregularities in Georgia and nothing to do with the federal government. They made it seem like Watergate. And Safire affixed gate to every story that came out of the Carter administration, because he was trying to make him seem like he was as bad as Nixon, which was ridiculous. He was too honest, Jim, I think is what happened to him. And he, on the night before the Democratic convention in 1980, when Ted Kennedy had launched this challenge to him, and as I said, a lot of that was Carter's fault. He did not handle that relationship well, and he made a lot of political mistakes. But Dan Rather is interviewing him and he asks him to grade himself. And Carter, like his staff was appalled. He actually says, well, Dan, I'd give myself a C plus on this, and a B minus on that, just imagine, like, think about Trump for a second, A plus on everything, right? Never admitted any error. Carter would give speeches where he would explain to the American people where he had gone wrong, what he had done wrong. Most famously in the malaise speech, as it was called, although he never used that word malaise. So you could argue, well, that wasn't very smart politically, and you would be right. But it is very appealing on a longer time frame when you look at the character of the president and the core decency that this man has.
Well, it's so true. You mentioned his stance on human rights, and of course, that to me is by far and away the most significant thing that he did as president, because it will endure really forever in the core makeup of our country relative to the world. And Jimmy Carter was a submarine engineer. That's what he was. A true engineer. And so his approach was to fix things.
Right.
He wasn't he wasn't a policy wonk. He's a very honest guy. If something is broken and needs to be fixed, then I'm going to fix it. And that was his approach for doing things, fixing problems. And I don't think that the media generally got that message, that they were looking for somebody that, maybe did walk on water, but Jimmy wasn't that kind of person, and he wasn't going to pretend that he was that kind of person.
I think that's exactly right. I have a chapter called His Inner Engineer, and he was a humanist struggling to escape being an engineer, and he, as a former president, he's written a novel, book of poetry, children's book. He's a painter, and many other, humanist refinements. But he was trained as an engineer, and that was his approach to problems. If you look in the corporate world, often the engineers fall just short of being CEO.
Right.
Because they're missing some equipment when it comes to making people like them and making people go along, because they think if we get to the right answer, we got the right answer. Let's move on it, and they don't understand at some level that getting to the right answer is just the beginning of the process. Then you have to convince other people that it's in their interest to recognize the right answer. So, say tax policy, this was one of his failures. He studied he was in many ways a policy wonk. Like, he'd get really into the weeds on tax policy and how we should close these loopholes and what the tax code should look like. And he was right that the tax code was and continues to be a disgrace. But then he fashioned his bill on that without consulting the chairman of the powerful tax writing committees on the Hill. So he just kind of dropped it in their lap. Needless to say, they would have preferred that they had been consulted.
That's right. Rostenkowski you're talking about.
No, this was before Rostenkowski, actually. It was on the House side, it was a guy named Al Ullman. Okay. And on the Senate side, it was Senator Russell Long of Louisiana, very powerful chair of the Senate Finance Committee. But, generally, this problem-solving quality led to real achievements. And we could talk all day about the long list of them. But just, a couple that became very relevant in the last year is that Donald Trump would not have been impeached if it were not for Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter introduced and signed the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 that provided the first protection for whistleblowers. Before that, there was no process for a whistleblower complaint. He signed the Inspector General's Act of 1978, the first offices of Inspector General. We know that was central to how this story about Trump and Ukraine came to light. And there was some talk of FISA courts. Those were established under Jimmy Carter. But then there were a lot of little things. Like before Carter, there were these 1930s regulations on breweries, so that made it basically impossible to start a craft brewery. Carter got rid of those ridiculous regulations, and we now have, craft beer in this country. Although it's only a few White House aides who hoist one in tribute to Jimmy Carter, because the rest of the world has no clue about this, and many, many other things like that. I mean, just again, to continue for a second on the broader scale. So I think people know that he's revolutionized the post-presidency and with the Carter Center. And, I don't, in part because there have been whole books written about his post-presidency, and in part because he didn't have the levers of power as a former president that he had as president, and in part because he let his ego get in the way a little bit in becoming kind of a freelance Secretary of State, which understandably really irritated some of his successors. I don't devote nearly as much space to his post-presidency as to his presidency as I do to his presidency, but he did revolutionize it, and he set a new standard for what we expect from our former presidents. Less well known is that he revolutionized the office of vice president.
Absolutely.
He was the first president to give the vice president any real duties and put him in the chain of military command. And this was Walter Mondale was his vice president. And I interviewed Mondale as well as the Carters and talked to him about that. Although things got so bad at one point when you were there that it came out years later that Mondale almost resigned in 1979. Things were going so badly. But he also revolutionized the role of the First Lady, he and Rosalind Carter. And I have in my books, the love letters, the very steamy love letters that he wrote her when he was in the Navy, which are definitely the steamiest of any between a president and First Lady. He was lusting in more than his heart. Let's put it that way. But what's really interesting is the formidable partnership that they had, and she was given much more authority than any prior First Lady, including Eleanor Roosevelt. And she introduced and shepherded to passage the first mental health bill in American history. She was a diplomat for her husband. She sat in on cabinet meetings. She did a lot to end age discrimination. She was a formidable First Lady and completely changed that role. So there were big things going on in this period that were overshadowed by these various flaps and mini scandals that stuck to him.
One of the things that really underscores what you say, Jonathan, about his humanity. He had it by the tons, but at the time of the great scandal perhaps it wasn't a scandal, but it was treated as a disaster when he fired his staff. He fired his cabinet members. There was so much consternation, so much strife, so much anxiety within the White House community. And his approach, I thought, was beautiful. Cora, my wife, and I had just given birth to our third child, but it was the first child that was born of a staff member in Carter's term.
Oh, really?
So he was born on the 20th, July 20th, right in the heart of the mess.
Yeah.
And so his approach to calming people down was to have a birth celebration
Wow.
for our son John.
Huh.
And the president sent one of his limousines to the hospital to pick up Cora and little John. And of course, his limousines were the if you recall the stress back then, the financial stress, were little Chrysler
Yeah.
vehicles that, they look like little station wagons, but that was the presidential limousine, the Jimmy Carter style. But he brought them to the White House, and he had a little party for the senior staff and others and my level, and it was wonderful. But that was his approach to
So interesting.
reducing the angst that just pervaded the White House.
I wish I had interviewed you, because that would have been good for me to tuck in the book, because I'm dealing with, this period pretty intensely. So this is the summer of 1979. You've had these gas lines, which they took them down into the mid-20s in popularity. People couldn't drive. And, people's cars then were like their phones now. They couldn't live without them. And so his popularity had gone up into the 70s, 30 points higher than Trump in 1977. But by 79, they're in the 20s. They're in Nixon, when he resigned, territory. And so he gives this so-called malaise speech, where he doesn't use the word malaise. And contrary to what most people remember, it's actually popular. It increases his popularity. He goes up in the polls because it was such an astonishing, unusual, moving speech. But then he makes one of the worst decisions of his presidency. I would say after his decision later in that year to allow the Shah of Iran, the deposed Shah of Iran, into the United States for medical treatment, which precipitated the seizure of the hostages in Tehran. After that bad decision, the next worst was firing half of his cabinet right when your son was born. And he's actually pretty frosty toward his cabinet. And people are seeing a side of Jimmy Carter that they did not like. And this is going on in the same period. So it's very interesting to me that he sensed that, and he tried to, make some gestures to bring a nicer feeling into when the staff would get together for something positive, because a lot of them at that time were really worried about where things were going to go. Were there going to be staff purges after the cabinet purge? And, Stu Eisenstadt, who was domestic policy chief, he writes in a book that he did, which is not a biography. It's about, his experience in the Carter presidency and the experience more broadly of the Carter administration. Good book. But he himself he says he saw a Jimmy Carter that month that your son was born that he hadn't seen before in the 13 years he'd been associated with him, who was, colder. I mean, we all know that he could be very cold in private. This image you have of him, always smiling. He's got the cardigan sweater, which, by the way, was very popular at the time. He's a tough guy beneath that surface. And when I asked him at one point what the biggest misconception that he thought people had of him, it was that he was weak. And he was right about that when he said that, because there's nothing weak about the guy. He was seen as weak because he didn't bomb Iran, but he was not weak. He is not weak. And what he is, as his son described him to me, he's intense, and he can be difficult. He can be a handful.
Yeah.
But there's this layered quality to him that I found so fascinating, because he can be Zen-like and genial and warm. But if you're not doing your job, or you're doing something else that he finds annoying, he will give you those steely blues, and you'll feel like the temperature just dropped, 40 degrees in the room.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you probably were lucky enough not to have that experience, but the senior staff all had it.
Yeah.
time or another.
It was never directly shown to me at me, but in my presence, his toughness was expressed. In fact, I want to get a little bit into that side. One of the things that I was looking for in your book, and I didn't really see it, was his impression of military strength, and his uh, sense that he indeed was doing the right thing in terms of protecting and enhancing the military power of the United States. He was viewed as being a very weak president with respect to his military posture. And I didn't see that at all in the way he conducted himself in his relationship to budgetary matters on the military and strategic matters with respect to our position vis-a-vis the Soviets.
Yeah,
And I wondered what your reaction.
right. So I have quite a bit about this in the book. I have a whole chapter on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and how Carter responded. He did so in ways that were popular at first and then extremely unpopular.
Right.
Grain embargo, which people remember to this day in the Farm Belt, boycotting the Olympics, which I think even Carter felt later was a bad idea. But what I was most left with is that the B-2 bomber was developed in the Carter Pentagon. I interviewed Harold Brown, his defense secretary, not long before he died. The weapons that did the most to convince the Soviet Union that they couldn't compete, it was not Star Wars, which was just on the drawing board.
Right.
It was things like principally the B-2 bomber, also the intermediate range nuclear missiles, which Carter, not Reagan, over the objections of a lot of Europeans, put into Europe. And so because he was photographed, Leonid Brezhnev wanted to kiss him after they signed the SALT II deal. He was seen as like this weakling or something. And then the Reaganites, of course, they went to town on that, and they just said he's weak, he's soft on communism over and over again. And the neoconservatives it was all bull. He was actually, in many ways, a Cold War president. And the so-called Carter Doctrine, which was that any effort to interrupt oil supplies in the Persian Gulf would be seen as an act of war. This was very connected to geostrategic interests in the region. And so, he increased defense spending by 5%. I was in a Zoom call with a group last night, and the editor of The Nation magazine, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, she was pressing me on, like, why was Carter such a Cold War hawk? Like, why did he listen to Brzezinski so much? So, but the thing about Carter is there was so much wasted newspaper coverage of the struggle between Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski. The assumption was that this Southern hick would be, putty in their hands, putty in Brzezinski's hand. No, he was his own Secretary of State. He knew an enormous amount. He had taught himself an enormous amount about foreign policy, and he became overall an excellent foreign policy president. And people who think, oh, that can't be, that's not the Jimmy Carter I remember, I would urge them to at least give me a hearing and read the book before they assume that I don't know what I'm talking about here, because the foreign policy achievements of the Carter administration were considerable.
I agree with you 100% on that. I was also very lucky that my secretary there in the White House was Jean Vance, who was the sister-in-law of Cy Vance,
right,
married to his older brother, John. And so there are a lot of things that, that you couldn't help but hear if you're interested in doing it, which I was. But clearly, President Carter had a wonderful grasp of international affairs and a natural tendency to try to fix what he saw was broken in the way our foreign policies were being managed or interrupted from being managed. One of the things that, again, the whole strength, the toughness in his dealing with military would come out in the annual review of the famous Defense Department Green Book. And you mentioned earlier in your book about the Rickover words to Jimmy Carter, his very best, do your best, and all that. And to see him go through that book, the presentation to him by the Office of Management and Budget on defense, was a wonderful thing to see. If you needed to be instilled with a spirit of, hey, we're in great shape and we're going to be in great shape, you just had to sit in this thing for about 15, 20 minutes. They were all-day sessions, by the way. He took a couple of days to go through the defense budget. His grasp of what was going on and what needed to go on and where the money needed to go was just spectacular. And you could never get that portrayed in the media, in the press. The press just had a totally different view of him as a milk toast guy.
Well, I think a lot of them, they also later, like I talked to Sam Donaldson, for instance, and some other reporters, they feel a little bad about the way they covered Carter. I think they now understand that they had a very incomplete picture of him. The flip side of that unbelievable knowledge about the specifics of policy was that it would annoy members of Congress because he would show them up.
Yeah.
But then on the positive side, many of his achievements were directly connected to this attention to detail that was often ridiculed. And so whether it was the Camp David Accords, which are the most durable, it's the most durable peace treaty since World War II, and the most important, actually, since World War II. There hasn't been a shot fired in anger between Israel and Egypt in 40 years, and they had fought 4 wars before that. He did not get the comprehensive Mideast peace, but this was a major accomplishment. And it's all about, in my Camp David chapter, it's all about this, what you're talking about, this real attention to detail.
Yeah.
That also, he one of the reasons he was such a great environmental president is that Alaska Lands Bill protected 105 million acres in Alaska. And when a senator from Alaska, a Republican senator, tried to come in and buffalo him and say, look, if you just make this change and this change and this change and this change, I'll be for it and the bill will pass. Carter knew, well, look, that's these headwaters where, that are very important environmentally for this reason. And this is a spawning ground for this. And, he knew them, as the guy said, Senator Stevens said when he left the office, he knew my state better than I did. So in that sense, this, I think that just to get back to the Pentagon for a second, he had this brilliant former head of the California Institute of Technology, Harold Brown, as his defense secretary. And they were developing all kinds of things that have changed our world, like a little thing called GPS, that this started in the Carter administration, the Pentagon. I don't know if you, this is not really directly related, but it just popped into my mind. I don't know if you knew somebody who was working about at your level in the on the National Security Council staff. She was analyzing spending on nuclear weapons, and her name is Ina Gartens, and she's known for something else nowadays. I think she's now right now she's the most successful cookbook author
Yeah,
out there.
yeah,
So there were like a lot of talented. She's a brilliant woman. There were a lot of talented people that he brought in, and when you would talk to the military, retired military, this idea that, oh, Carter was this weakling and then Ronald Reagan came in and he restored our defense. I said, that's just not true. That's not what was actually happening. That was something, it was early Republican, very effective
yeah,
spin.
yeah,
And the other thing that the chiefs were very grateful to Carter for is they didn't want to have a permanent presence of 100,000 troops in Panama. And they told Carter, if you can't get this treaty ratified, that's what it's going to be. And because once somebody sabotages the Panama Canal, once there's a terrorist incident, we got to go down there with a huge number of troops forever, because you don't want to risk another attack by leaving. So turning over that canal was enormously important. This is how Reagan rose in national politics, was by attacking the idea of turning over the Panama Canal. But he gets into office, and of course he realizes, like the Joint Chiefs did, this is a huge benefit for our national security that we have done this, because now we don't have to worry about the sabotage of the canal. And of course was also very helpful in ending the whole gringo go home thing and leading to the democratization of most of Latin America, which much of that came out of the Panama Canal story, which when I started this, I thought Panama Canal, it's a little sleepy, not that interesting. And it turns out it was absolutely fascinating. And the fight over it is so colorful because 2/3 of the country's against it. Carter needs 2/3 of the Senate to get this through. And, at one point, just the way, some senators, Ted Kennedy and John Culver, they lit matches to smoke this senator out of the phone booth to make sure that he voted the right way. And they hoodwinked Senator Sam Hayakawa of California. Carter read his book and appealed to his ego. And I just got to tell this quick story because I haven't been able to tell it elsewhere. And it tells you so much about Carter. And recently I got a call from Ted Koppel, who's in the book, and he just called to tell me that he was enjoying the book. And he mentioned the story that I'm about to tell you as one of his favorites. So they desperately need every single vote. And they need this guy, Sam Hayakawa's vote. He's an elderly, eccentric former professor who got elected to the Senate from California for shutting down student demonstrators, black student demonstrators, as a matter of fact. And, having done that appealed to a certain element. He gets elected to the Senate, but he's a real pedant, and he's an author of a book about semantics. And so Carter and Howard Baker, a Republican who was supporting the treaty, and Vice President Mondale, they hatched this plan, and they have Hayakawa in Baker's office, and they time it so the president calls, and he says, Howard, I want you to ask Senator Hayakawa if he would come over and talk to me about foreign policy, and I'd really appreciate that. So Hayakawa, who's egotist, flattered, he goes over, meets with Carter, spouts off about foreign policy, and he gives Carter his 800-page, unbelievably boring book about semantics. Carter does something no American president would do. He reads the book.
yeah,
And Hayakawa is so pleased that he's read the book that he's starting to move toward voting for the treaties. They desperately need his vote. But Hayakawa's not done yet. And he says, well, you passed my test. You read my book. But I want to schedule a regular meeting with you. I want to come by every 2 weeks and talk to you about foreign policy. So Carter says, he was called Sam Hayakawa. He goes, oh, Sam, I so benefit from your wise counsel, but I can't limit it to a certain schedule. I might need you to come over more frequently than that for these consultations on foreign policy. And so I don't want to have it be on any schedule. If it's okay with you, we won't have it on any schedule. And so Hayakawa says, oh, that's okay. He votes for the treaty. And then, of course, that's the last time he ever sees him. President Carter. So
that's Carter,
that's Carter. He could be pretty tough when he needed to.
I hate to do this, but we're going to run out of Zoom time. And I wanted to ask you before we end this.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. No, you guys could go on for days. And I love listening to it. But what I wanted to ask both of you, you, Jim, from the inside, and you, Jonathan, from the outside. I mean, there's so many things you've said, especially because the Olympics affected me when I was younger. The optics, as they would now call it,
yes.
all wrong. They were just all wrong.
All wrong.
But wasn't there someone, I always thought like you should always have with you your best friend from third grade. And he should be your wingman. And he should say to you, maybe you shouldn't do this.
Yeah. So
why wasn't there somebody there?
There was Gerald Rafshoon, who was a major source for my book. And they called his optics Rafshoonery, and he would send these messages to Carter, you have to act like a leader. And so like when Carter canceled Hail to the Chief, because he tried to depump the White House. So when Rafshoon came in, and he had been his media advisor and helped get him elected, he, with Rosalind, who was much savvier politically and on the optics than Jimmy, they just restored Hail to the Chief without even telling Carter. They're like, this is crazy. You're depumping the White House to a point where you're really hurting yourself. And he gave him a number of other suggestions, some of which Carter tried to do, but he couldn't because he just wasn't as good a communicator, especially as Ronald Reagan. I mean, he was succeeded by an actor. So our idea of him as a poor communicator is accurate, but it's partly conditioned by the fact that he was succeeded by Reagan. And Reagan was he was a much worse president in terms of getting things done for the country. And when Carter put up solar panels on the roof of the White House, Reagan took them down. That tells you a little something about how far-sighted Reagan was, short-sighted Reagan was compared to Carter. But when it came to communications, they called Reagan the great communicator for a good reason.
So Jim, you were on the inside, and were you aware of this? Were you able to have enough perspective at the time to say, this is kind of going wrong?
Well, a lot was going on, but just to bolster one of the things that Jonathan said, the way to get to Jimmy, to his personality, was through Rosalind. And she had a very powerful impact on him as advisor. And that's the route that Ann Wexler took, that very few others could take. Get to Jimmy through Rosalind. And that's the way you did it. Now, Jimmy, again, he was a very strong guy, and sometimes he would listen, and sometimes he wouldn't. I mean, that's just the way he was.
So at one point, I asked Rosalind. I interviewed the Carters, their home in Plains, on a Habitat for Humanity site in Memphis, Napa, a bunch of different places, a bunch of different times. And at one point, I asked, "Is your husband stubborn?" And she just laughed. This is like his, and she said, of course he's stubborn, So he definitely did not listen to her all the time, and he was often his own worst enemy. But there were things going on in the country that really led to his defeat. Some of which was not of his making. So inflation
Yeah.
came out of the Arab oil embargo and all kinds of things that were beyond his control. His undoing was partly because right around the time your son was born, he appointed Paul Volcker to be chairman of the Federal Reserve. And we all know that the Federal Reserve has much more to do with the economy than
Right.
the president does. And Volcker's way of ending inflation was to jack up interest rates. So can you imagine running for re-election when interest rates are over 15%? People are trying to start businesses and buy homes, and you have like 18% interest rates. No wonder he lost. So to my mind, the bad economy was the first cause of his defeat. The fact that he couldn't get the hostages out before the election was obviously very important, and the hostage rescue mission, very dramatic story there, that failed. And then the fact that he didn't have a united Democratic Party and that Ted Kennedy had challenged him was a big factor. So all of these things combined to undo him. And it's also true that Reagan in their one debate was just a much better performer than he was.
Yeah. No question about that.
All right. You guys, we could all go on forever, but I just can't do it in this format. If we were around at a book club, yeah, this would be great. But Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. Jim, it's great that the two of you have this different perspective. And yeah, probably, Jonathan, it would have been good if you had a chance to interview.
And I love independent bookstores. I love bookshop.org. I love Wellington. I love Watch on Booksellers in my town in New Jersey. So I think you guys are. I put you in with local newspapers as the lungs of democracy. We have to have people like you.
And the thing about it is that the reason why Jim's so good and we have another guy named Mike is because they can curate, like with the Lucas Project, they can curate things that otherwise, and you know what? I don't really care. I mean, I have my bestsellers up there on the front table too, but this is the kind of thing that makes independent bookstores so valuable, that you come into a store, you don't know that you're looking for this.
Right.
And then someone can tell you why this is something that's going to be very important to you and your life.
Yes, yeah. And my book's going into a second printing, so it's doing well, but it's hard to be an independent bookseller, and it's hard to be an author amid a pandemic. So I think we need to do more things like this to get the word out.
I agree. And anytime you want to, we'll talk again, because we could go on.
I'm happy. I hope you can be in touch with some of your colleagues at other places, because there's a long history of independent booksellers, really moving books, like really changing things when they,
COVID
when they recommend books to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
That's when you get that word of mouth, and then the other ones put them out front and tell their very loyal customers about certain books. So
yeah, and you're right. One of the odd things that COVID has done is multiplied that, because this will be out there, and I can also just tweet it or Instagram it out to all my other bookseller friends, and that'll sell books.
And by the way,
that would happen.
By the way, I am. You said I was so busy. This is my priority right now that Trump is gone and Biden won. My priority now is talking about this book. So if some of your colleagues, at other bookstores want to do something like this that they think their customers would appreciate, I'm happy to do it.
I will do my best, and I know Jim will too. So thanks again, Jonathan.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. And great talking to you, Jim. Great interview.
Thanks.
See you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.